So you are being recorded on YouTube, just to let you know.
Thank you. Anything we say can and will be used against us.
Mr. Albright, we are recording on YouTube, just to let you know.
Right, I thought I would just join here in case, I mean, I will kill the video and stuff. Keith Herman's just going to present for us today jointly, but in the event there are questions from either the hearing examiner or for me specifically with regard to the county, Bernalillo County, I'll be on Zoom, but I'll go ahead and mute myself and also probably suppress the video.
Okay.
How are you today, by the way?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, good. Okay. So I will stop the video and I will mute. And I meant to ask, can you hear me okay? Is the audio coming through all right?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay, great, thanks.
Jeff, it's very clear and very persuasive.
I guess at this point we can just wrap it up then.
Anna, this is Peter Gould. I'm just testing out my audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay, and I'm going to mute myself until it's my turn. I looked at the hearing examiner's order And I go last on my argument among CCAE, after CCAE and WRA and REIA. So I'll just I'll turn my video on here once the thing starts, but I'm going to mute right now. Thank
All
you.
right. Mhm.
Okay.
Bye.
And Anna, this is Jeff again as well. Thanks for all your hard work. You've been kind of busy lately. Appreciate all your efforts there trying to keep up with all of this stuff.
You're welcome. Well, I like it.
Rather you than me.
Hello, Muriel. Can you hear me, Mr. Nassi?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I just said hello.
Or good
But
afternoon.
but when you didn't answer, I was worried your audio wasn't working because that happens.
Yeah. Good afternoon. How are you today?
Good. It's been a while.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be back in person sometime soon.
Yes, ma'am. Hey, Brad.
I'm still muted. So yeah, hi, how are you?
Good.
Hi, Brad. Hi, Peter. Hi, Ray.
Guten Nachmittag.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good
Hi,
afternoon.
I've got a complaint. Every time I get on the Zoom, there's this old bald guy sitting in a library in somebody's basement who's stealing my identity. I don't know what's going on.
You don't think that's a far more dignified than my cat?
Oh, that's right. You got the cat. Yeah, that's what we were aiming for. Dignity, not intelligence, dignity.
I lost that over 30 years ago. So
This is Jeff. I was going to say I better just log out now.
Yeah, well, yeah. We were going to actually suggest that for you, Jeff.
That's mean, Peter.
I know it is, but Jeff and I have been seeing too much of each other lately. So familiarity, you know,
Uh-oh. You need to share more.
we do. Must
Mr.
have been-
Gold, Mr. Gold, is Kelly going to join us?
No, she is not.
Thank you.
She's actually doing some work this afternoon.
That happens.
And again, before we get started, just to reiterate here that Keith will be giving the oral argument on behalf of both of us. You know, I just joined the Zoom in the event that there's questions from the hearing examiner, or if any of the commissioners may show up and have questions directly of the county.
Can you hear me okay? Sometimes I get a little bit of a fishbowl effect in my office.
You do have that. Hi, Keith.
So yes, it does sound like I'm in a fishbowl
A
Yep.
a little bit.
to the point where I should mess with my audio, or
I think you're good, but be sure you enunciate.
will do.
Dave, I just sent you an email with a list of the persons who will be participating in this hearing.
Okie doke. Hello, Judge. How are you?
Good afternoon, all. I'm looking to see if I have any of the commissioners on with all of us, and I'm not sure. Ms. Kippenbrock,
Yes.
do we
Yes,
have any?
Yes, we have Commissioner Maestas present.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm admitting Mr. Elliott,
All right.
and I want to wait. I'm not sure if the commissioners are still involved in the interconnection workshop, possibly. Commissioner Maestas, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if the interconnection meeting is still going on. I didn't participate.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll just wait. I'm going to admit Ms. Zur.
Mr.
Wait,
Medeiros, Mr. Medeiros, I'm going to fill up my water bottle. I'll be right back.
all right, that's good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lee. So I'm just going to wait.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, we are live on YouTube, just to remind you this.
All right. I'm just going to wait a few minutes until we get on the record and start the oral argument. I will note that the reason for the delay is to await the participation potentially of, obviously the participants, but also any commissioners who may also want to attend. But I won't wait that much longer because we have a lot to get to in this oral argument. And I've, as you know, I've limited the time for the argument because we have a lot of presenters and a somewhat complex subject matter to deal with during this oral argument, at least in some respects. So I hope everybody is well.
Thank you, Mr. Hearingsheimer, Marilyn Nassi. Good afternoon, and good afternoon, Commissioner Maestas. And everybody else. We were talking beforehand, so we all said hello to each other beforehand.
It's
Okay,
good to
great.
see you all.
Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping matters. With regard to keeping time on the arguments, I was thinking of holding this up at 5 and 1 minute. Can you all see that?
Yes, sir.
Rather than interrupt the argument, I'd like to hold this up. Or if that fails, then something smaller, an iPhone, but I'm going to try and use that. And that'll be at 5 minutes and 1 minute. And anybody? Okay,
Mr.
I think we
Medeiros,
should
hi.
probably.
Yeah, this is
Mr.
Peter
Gould,
Gould.
go
I
ahead.
just want to let you know before we start, I'm not going to, I think I'll have a very short argument. I go after most people and right before staff, and I think most of the arguments will have been made. And so I'll try to keep it brief, but I'm not going to save any of my time for rebuttal. So when I'm done, I'm done. You don't need to. I know that there was a provision in your order that we could save time for rebuttal. So
Yeah, well, there was a provision in my order that allows the petitioners
okay.
to save time for rebuttal because I grappled with that and I thought that that'll become a free for all if everybody is allowed to do rebuttal. So I limited the rebuttal in inverse order to the extent that there's any available to the petitioner PNM and the joint petitioners, Water Authority and the county, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
If I can ask about the inverse order, Mr. Medeiros, that would mean whatever time we have for rebuttal, the Water Authority would go first and then PNM would close?
That's correct. And before I begin, I'm happy to give you the reason for that. I noticed
Mr.
in the
Hearing
briefing.
Examiner, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you don't need me, I have another Zoom meeting with the Chief of Staff, but I can log in back later to deal with the YouTube.
That's fine, Ms. Kippenbrock. Thank you so much for getting us going. Really, truly appreciate it. Thank you. So I noticed that in the way the arguments are structured, that the Water Authority is responding to PNM's previous arguments in a prior docket. So I felt that they should go first and go last in that sense, if that, you understand? But you'd still get the opportunity to provide rebuttal right before, in addition to PNM. I didn't want to foreclose the joint petitioners the opportunity for some rebuttal as well.
Yes, I understand. The
Okay.
fact that there's two of us, one of us is going to have to go first and one will have to go second. So we don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, this is Mr. Albright on behalf of the county. And as I mentioned in previous email, Mr. Herman will be making the arguments on behalf of both of us. I just will be available in the event there are questions that you have either directly for the county or only related to the county or that Commissioner Maestas might have. So I'm just going to mute myself and also just suppress my video.
Well, when we're about to go, thank you, Mr. Albright. We're about to go on the record. Excuse me for a second. That I don't know if that light those lights behind me were perhaps a little too bright, so I turned that off. The way I'm going to do it, Mr. Albright, I'm going to take appearances on the record when I begin in just a minute. And I'm going to ask for the appearance of the joint petitioners, starting with Mr. Herman. And then I'll get his appearance. And then at the same time, right after him, you can enter your appearance for the county.
Yeah, that'll be
And,
fine. Thank you, sir.
And the same will go, by the way, Ms. Zara and Mr. Marks, for you, since you filed a joint brief, a joint argument, basically. I'll do the same when I get to you, but I'm going to go in the order of the arguments in getting the appearances. And Mr. Elliott, since the Attorney General did not present a brief pursuant to the procedure order, I did not provide for the Attorney General to make oral argument pursuant to the procedure order requirements.
That's fine. Thank you.
But thank you, sir. All right, well, let's go ahead and start. Mr. Lee, are you ready?
Can I ask
Yes.
one other question? Does
Yes, ma'am.
New Energy Economy have the opportunity for rebuttal or no?
No, only the petitioners.
Okay.
And I'm glad you raised that right now, because just as the Attorney General who joined the briefs of New Energy Economy joined the petition. And so that's the reason for that. Okay.
I'm ready,
You
Judge.
will have a chance to argue, I think, pursuant to your order, right? Or no? I thought you said that.
You have 10 minutes.
Yep.
When you, right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll get to that. I'm going to read into the record those requirements in just a minute. So we're going to get started now, Mr. Lee.
Yes, sir.
Okay. This matter before the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission will please come to order. This is a time and place set for the oral argument in this declaratory order proceeding, which is docketed as New Mexico Public Regulation Commission case number 20-00212-UT and involves two petitions for declaratory order, consolidated by order of the commission issued March 17, 2021. The petitions are Public Service Company of New Mexico's petition for a declaratory order regarding whether the Efficient Use of Energy Act, the EUEA for short, permits a utility to implement a full revenue decoupling mechanism, and the petition of Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority and Bernalillo County for a declaratory order regarding whether the EUEA mandates the commission to fully authorize full decoupling upon petition by a public utility. My name is Anthony Medeiros. I'm the hearing examiner assigned by the commission to preside over this case and issue a recommended decision with findings of fact and conclusions of law with respect to the legal issues the commission addressed the hearing examiner to analyze and make recommendations with respect to in his recommended decision, my recommended decision. The oral argument is being held in accordance with the procedure order entered in this docket on March 30, 2021, as modified by the hearing examiner's July 8, 2021 order regarding oral argument. With the parties who requested Zoom invitations to this oral argument, please enter their appearances, starting with petitioner PNM.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ray Gifford of the law firm Wilkinson Barker Nauer, appearing on behalf of Public Service Company of New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Gifford. Nice to see you. Next, who appears for the joint petitioners, Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority, going by ABCWA, and Bernalillo County?
Good afternoon, Mr. Examiner. Keith Herman on behalf of the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority. I am also partnered with my co-counsel Jeff Albright, but I will be doing the argument. I will let Mr. Albright introduce himself.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hearing Examiner and Commissioner Maestas and my colleagues. Jeff Albright from J. Albright Law, LLC. I'm representing Bernalillo County. Mr. Herman will be presenting the oral argument on behalf of both of us, but I'll certainly be available in the event that you have questions, Mr. Hearing Examiner, or if Commissioner Maestas has specific questions directed to the county. And so I will mute myself and also turn off my video during the proceeding, but I will be here.
Thank you, Mr. Albright. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Herman. Who appears for our new energy economy?
Good afternoon, hearing examiner Medeiros and Commissioner Maestas and colleagues. My name is Marielle Nanasi, and on behalf of New Energy Economy, I will be providing a brief oral argument. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who appears for Coalition for Clean Affordable Energy, CCAE, Western Resource Advocates, WRA, and the Renewable Energy Industries Association, REIA?
Good afternoon. This is Jason Marks. I appear for REIA, and then I also appear to argue the joint brief of CCAE, WRA, and REIA.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Ms. Zur, are you also appearing?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, Mr. Hearing Examiner, Commissioner Maestas, and colleagues. Stephanie Zur on behalf of the Coalition for Clean Affordable Energy, and I will just be observing. Mr. Marks will be arguing on behalf of the joint respondent.
And this question is directed to Mr. Marks and Ms. Zur. In the recommended decision, do you have a shorthand term for CCAE/WRA/REIA that I could use, you could suggest? That seems kind of cumbersome. But you don't have to answer it now, but if you have a suggestion at some point, let me know. But if you have one now, fine.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, I don't have a suggestion. You will note we weren't able to come up with something in our brief. I think that the acronyms with a slash in between wouldn't be too cumbersome, but
well, okay, I'll go with that unless I come up with something else. But I appreciate that. Okay.
You know, as you know, CCAE and WRA are advocacy groups. We're all nonprofits, but REIA is an industry group. So we're not,
right.
You know, we're
and
not
completely
NGOs.
Yeah,
not entirely environmentals.
Yeah, I mean we're aligned in this case. If I was appearing for Sierra Club, when we three and appear with Ms. Zur and them, we call ourselves the environmental groups. But I
was going to go with EGs for short, but I can't do that here. So okay, you follow me then. Thank you.
Yes, I do.
And I understand the issue. Who appears for New Mexico Affordable Reliable Energy Alliance?
Mr. Hearing Examiner, good afternoon. Commissioner Maestas, good afternoon. And colleagues, Peter Gould, I'm appearing on behalf of the New Mexico Affordable Reliable Energy Alliance. The acronym is NM area. And, or you can just call me Bub. I'll answer to that too.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gould. And staff of the Commission's Utility Division.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. On behalf of Utility Division staff, Bradford A. Borman.
Thank you, Mr. Borman. And New Mexico Attorney General.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Gideon Elliott for the Attorney General's Office.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Good afternoon. All right. This matter was also set as a potential public comment hearing. However, let the record reflect that although the opportunity was extended in the procedure order and in the notice of this event on the Commission's website, no one requested to make oral argument. However, the opportunity to provide written comments regarding this matter is still open. Written comments may be submitted before the Commission takes final action in this matter by sending the comment, which shall reference case 20-00212-UT to prc.records@state pnm.ns. Now for the order and content of oral argument. The petitioners in these consolidated proceedings, PNM in case number 20-00211UT, which was subsequently closed, and ABCWA in the county in case number 20-00212-UT, shall present their arguments first and will be followed by New Energy Economy, who filed a joinder in the joint petition in case number 20-00212-UT, this docket. New Energy Economy then will be followed by the interveners who filed briefs, and then staff. At the start of their arguments, the petitioners may reserve unused time for rebuttal. PNM will go first, followed by the joint petitioners, ABCWA in the county. Ms. Nanazi for New Energy Economy will go next, followed by the argument of Mr. Marks for CCAE, WRA, and REIA. Mr. Gould for New Mexico area will go next and will be followed by staff. Finally, again, if the petitioners seek leave to reserve unused argument time for rebuttal, the argument will close in inverse order, as we discussed off the record at the beginning. ABCWA county, the joint petitioners will go first, and finally PNM. Please be advised again that points of substance that should be made in the argument itself may not be reserved for rebuttal. Now, the time for argument will not exceed 15 minutes for the respective petitioners and 10 minutes each for New Energy Economy, interveners, and staff. Council is not required to use all the allotted time. I, the hearing examiner, will give council 5-minute and 1-minute warnings as timed on this iPad. Additional content provisions. Council advocating the same position on an issue should try to avoid duplicative argument to the extent practicable. Council should not read at length from briefs, records, or authorities. Council should assume that the hearing examiner and commission have read the briefs and responses before oral argument. And finally, the hearing examiner, I will do my best, and I respectfully ask the commissioners to do theirs, to reserve questions for any council until the end of their argument in order to allow council the full amount of time allotted to make their arguments without significant interruption. Are there any questions of the participants? Very well then, let's proceed to the oral argument. Mr. Gifford for PNM will start. He has 15 minutes. Mr. Gifford?
Thank you, Your Honor, Commissioner, colleagues, and Bub. I would like to reserve, if I might, 3 minutes for rebuttal at the outset. Hopefully I will take less than my now 12 minutes. I do want to take some time at the outset to talk about how we find ourselves here and what we're hoping, I think, collectively to achieve. As all the parties know, last spring, PNM filed an application to decouple the rates of 2 specific rate classes. That petition proceeded forward through administrative litigation and discovery through the summer. And into the fall, it became clear to us, and I think collectively to all the parties, that there were some threshold legal questions that would need to be resolved before we could get to the merits of any specific decoupling proposal that might come before the commission. And of course, that any decoupling rate mechanism that was approved would only go into effect after our next rate case in any event. We decided then, with permission of Your Honor, to go forward instead of with that actual petition, with this petition, or these rather dueling or complementary petitions for declaratory order. And what PNM seeks from this proceeding is a degree of legal clarity and an informed opinion of the commission of how and whether it should go forward with a decoupling proposal in a future general rate case, and how that proposal might be fashioned to comply with the Efficient Use of Energy Act, and particularly the amendments to the Efficient Use of Energy Act, and how that might or might not be structured. So that's what I think we're all collectively trying to achieve here out of this proceeding, is a construction of the Efficient Use of Energy Act so that PNM, as the ultimate applicant here, can decide if and how and whether to go forward with decoupling into the future. Now, what we've asked for, Your Honor, is 5 declarations in our petition. And let me just go through them in brief, which is 1, that 6217(5)(f)(2) of the Efficient Use of Energy Act authorizes what we've called full revenue decoupling. 2, that applying a decoupling mechanism to a subset of rate classes does not facially violate Section 6286 of New Mexico statutes. 3, that the standalone petition brought under 6217(5)(f)(2) does not violate the single issue rate making principle. 4, that the modified revised stipulation in 16-000276 UT does not stop PNM from seeking to implement a decoupling mechanism before the next rate case. And finally, Section 6217(5)(f)(4) prohibits the commission from reducing PNM's overall weighted average cost of capital based on approval of a decoupling mechanism. We also ask in reply and rebuttal that the commission deny the declarations sought by the joint petitioners and New Energy Economy. As you will see as we proceed forward, there is some substantial overlap between what the two sides are asking for here. But what we think the core of this and the core certainty we'd like and the core determination that we're going to be arguing about here today is, what does subsection F2 mean for decoupling as a matter of public policy in the state of New Mexico? And what PNM submits and what the parties who support us submit is that this is a case that can be decided on the plain language of 6217(5)(f)(2), and that plain language of the statute does require the commission, because it's written as the commission shall adopt a rate mechanism that ensures that revenue per customer approved by the commission in a general rate case is recovered by the public utility without regard to the quantity of electricity or natural gas actually sold by the public utility. What we submit is that the plain language of that subsection, which was added to the statute in 2019, mandates the commission accept a proposal to fully decouple rates, either in the electricity or natural gas arena. The relevant language and the language we would direct you to as dispositive here is that it is without regard to electricity or natural gas actually sold. What is significant there is both what is said and what is not said, Your Honor. And what is said is that a mechanism, a full decoupling mechanism, is warranted without any limitation on the reason for which that mechanism might be implemented, which is to say, it's not like, if we go contextually to the rest of the statute, like subsection F1, it does not have that qualification and that balance that subsection F1 does. Therefore, what we submit the thrust of this case is about is that you can go as the judge here to subsection F2 and decide favorably for our petition just based on that plain language. This is the language of full decoupling as pointed out by CCAE and those petitioners who are still looking for the clever acronym. I think it's notable also how this subsection F2 came into the statute. And this subsection F2 came into the statute after a series of commission decisions that limited subsection F1 to a lost revenue adjustment mechanism or a partial decoupling that was premised on energy efficiency or load management programs. Those earlier series of decisions, both in rulemakings and in cases involving both PNM and others, had found that subsection F1 was limited to a partial decoupling and required a showing by the utility that these lost revenues came about because of energy efficiency or load management. By contrast here, subsection F2 came into the statute in 2019, in some sense in reaction by the legislature to that, and said, no, the commission shall have a full decoupling, shall institute a full decoupling upon petition of the public utility. It's notable that none of the qualifiers from F1 transfer down into subsection F2. There's no limitation of the decoupling mandate to energy efficiency and load mandate. There's also no balancing of interests of ratepayers and so forth as exists in subsection F1. Thank you, Your Honor. I will move on. I will add that this also doesn't violate section 62-8-6, that you can go to a, I'm sorry.
Mr. Cuthbert, I'm not taking, I'll add the time back, but I want to emphasize that I'm timing you on 12 minutes, assuming that you wanted to reserve those 3 minutes.
Please.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think the rest of it, I think, can go a little more quickly, which is this plain language, again, of subsection F2 allows the statute to be applied, or the decoupling to applied to a subset of rate classes and not all rate classes. That, again, is the specific language of subsection F2 that says can be calculated, quote, for the rate class or classes. That indicates a clear intent of the legislature that it can be brought as to specific rate classes and need not be brought as to all rate classes. Furthermore, if you look at and read it in parallel with section 62-8-6, New Mexico Supreme Court has been very clear that it applies to arbitrary actions and arbitrary rate distinctions. This is not an arbitrary rate distinction. In fact, there could be a very compelling case that you only decouple certain rate classes and not others, insofar as some rate classes have recover more of their fixed costs through volumetric rates, which is really the incentive problem that decoupling as a regulatory policy is aimed at solving. The further issue is the standalone petition. That is also, we think, allowed by the plain language of 62-17-5F2. It says you can bring that petition. It does not link the need for that petition to be brought within the ambit of a general rate case. Again, this is at this point something of a hypothetical question, because the purpose of this proceeding is whether or not PNM would bring forth the decoupling proceeding in its next general rate case. Finally, and quickly, I would like to say the modified revised stipulation does not stop us here. We did bring that petition in a subsequent rate case. That petition was then dismissed as the legislature was beginning to act. So what PNM would submit is that obligation from the modified revised stipulation has already been met and satisfied. Therefore, there is no estoppel. And finally, I do want to spend some time on 62-17-5F4, which prohibits the commission from reducing PNM's overall weighted average cost of capital based on approval of a decoupling mechanism. That, I think, prohibition is clear and by the plain language. I would point out, however, Your Honor, that the commission can't do indirectly what it's prohibited to do directly, which is to say it could not change the debt equity ratio, for instance, of PNM, or manipulate the weighted average cost of capital to achieve the same goal effectively as reducing the return on equity. And that's what F4 does. And with that, with a minute left, I will be silent, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Gifford. That means you have 4 minutes of rebuttal. Mr. Maestas, do you have any questions for Mr. Gifford for PNM?
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gifford, I do have you, if I may.
Please.
Regarding the issue of disincentives in the statute 6217(5) F, and just also before that in the statute, when it talks about disincentives, I noticed in your brief that you talk about regulatory disincentives, and then you talk about some other types of disincentives. Are they all regulatory disincentives besides developing cost-effective energy efficiency and load management programs? For instance, macroeconomic effects, weathers, downturn in the economy, downturn in the economy due to inflation, a banking collapse, pandemic, which is a epic force majeure event. Is there any distinction between regulatory disincentives and economic or other disincentives in your mind?
I don't think so, Your Honor. I think because the regulatory disincentives are the crux of the problem that are caused by those other kind of exogenous events. And the regulatory incentives come about in the area of rate design, right? And rate design, when a utility, and this is how decoupling came about, why the environmental advocates in the 1990s and 2000s came up with decoupling as a mechanism. When a utility recovers a large portion or a disproportionate or any portion of its fixed costs through a volumetric charge, that utility then has a perverse incentive to recover the throughput incentive, right? And so those exogenous economic collapse, weather events, and so forth are not the primary problem. The problem is a rate design problem. And there are some certainly legitimate reasons why you might have rate design that is not a full straight fixed variable rate design. But what decoupling is trying to do is correct that regulatory disincentive caused by a rate design that creates this throughput incentive where your utility has what particularly environmental advocates would consider to be bad incentives to sell more power, not less.
But the bad incentive to sell more power may be because it has lost part of its customer base, right?
Well, I think what you
go ahead.
Well, I think if you had something like that happen, that part of its customer base leaves or so forth, what you would get as an alternative is a lot of more frequent rate cases, right? Because the utility would still have its cost of service, and that cost of service would remain largely fixed. And if all of a sudden, let's say 10% of a utility's load suddenly went away, what that would create is a regulatory incentive for the utility to come in with a rate case to reallocate all those fixed costs across the remaining customer base and recover that. So I still think you're mainly we're mainly aiming at here is that throughput incentive caused by rate design. And it's only secondarily affected by those events you mentioned.
But you want to limit it, confine it to only disincentives caused by regulation of energy efficiency or conservation measures, right?
Well, that's what subsection F1 did and does. What we contend is that subsection F2 is a much broader full decoupling mandate. And the full decoupling is,
right,
as we may, it is indifferent to whatever exogenous reasons there are. And that's the public policy mandate here.
And that's where we're going. I'm trying to precisely pinpoint where that pivot that PNM is making there with regard to from F1 to F2, the new provision. And in that regard, I noticed that, and I carried it along into the procedural order. Both you and CCA, WRA, REIA use full or limited decoupling terms. I was curious why you never use the term partial in your briefs. Partial decoupling. And I think you may know where I'm going with that. Because I'm not.
I'm trying to think back what I think what we were doing, and I can't speak for CCA, WRA, and REIA. There is a literature out there on decoupling, and I think the convention in the literature, I'm trying to just give my innocent answer, is that you use full or limited decoupling. I don't think there was any conscious leisure demand there, Your Honor.
But there is something in between, because the way I understand the argument is you set up, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but it's sort of a straw man. It's either full decoupling or limited decoupling, which is not decoupling, right? And yet the literature that you cite the commission to talks about something in between, which is partial decoupling, which is cited in one of the articles with regard to partial decoupling as a creative solution. The A-Vista Utilities from Washington, from the Washington Commission, right? And that partial decoupling is, as I understand it, a percentage, a 90% margin decoupling, but it's decoupling, and it's based on losses due to DSM programs, as I understand it. But the literature treats it as decoupling, focused decoupling, correct?
Yeah, yes, Your Honor. And I guess what I'd say is there are, to be sure, different flavors and different gradations of decoupling, and I wouldn't deny that. You can see them in different kind of versions of decoupling and different aims of decoupling.
But when you present the commission and as I need to precisely grapple with what this provision means. The F2, the new F2, brought about by the EU, the amendments to brought about in 2019. But there's something in between decoupling, full decoupling, and no decoupling, which is what you say the LCFC or the lost cause mechanism or the RBA. None of those things are decoupling because they're limited. So it's one or the other, but there's partial in between, and partial is focused on removing the regulatory disincentive, at least in the Washington Utilities Commission case, at least up until 2016, the rate case that I did some research on it, in the Washington Utilities Transportation Commission dockets with regard to how far that decoupling mechanism for that utility and other utilities has gone. But that partial decoupling mechanism may inform possibly the language here.
Yeah, I guess what I would say Your Honor, I think I agree with you that there are different types of decoupling with different aims. What I would offer to you is that the language of subsection F2 is a mandatory language where the utility has the option to bring forward a decoupling proposal, and that the language of F2 allows that proposal to be what we have termed a full decoupling proposal. And it is mandatory to the commission to accept that insofar as it falls within the ambit of this language, which is if a utility brought forward a proposal that satisfied the without regard to the quantity of electricity or natural gas actually sold, the commission would be required to accept it.
So this amendment to F2 potentially subverts the regulatory paradigm, the regulatory compact.
No,
right? That's what you suggest. It takes it out of the traditional analysis for setting rates within a zone of reasonableness, taking into account the public interest, the shareholders, ratepayers, everybody. And just as the commission now is bound, the commission shall, the commission is mandated to do this because this one subsection says so.
It does not, Your Honor, I submit, upend the regulatory compact, because let's remember, decoupling isn't changing the any of the cost of service requirement, the obligation of the utility to prove up its and adequately allocate costs between rate classes and so on and so forth. So it's not an increase in costs to any consumer. It's a rate design principle that's made mandatory, not an upending of the regulatory compact by any stretch of the imagination.
Is there any guidance on how it's applied in the statute?
Guidance on how the decoupling proposal would be applied?
Well, we do not have a definition of regulatory disincentives. Let's start there.
That's correct.
And then with regard to how one would develop wholesale full decoupling, is there any guidance in the statute on that?
This statute F2 here is not so prescriptive as to say this is how you shall do full decoupling. There is a set of norms.
Right, there are a set of norms, but those norms harken back to the balancing that we're talking about and how one develops rates. And you're suggesting that those limitations aren't carried forward to F2.
I am, yes, Your Honor. And it's notable that it's not in F2 and could have been, but the legislature didn't do that.
No, the legislature did a lot in that statute, in that 2019 legislation, didn't it?
That's what we contend, as you can see in our briefing, yes.
This is one of among many provisions that deal with a host of different issues, including retirement of certain coal generating facilities, right?
As we both know, Your Honor, that in many states across the country, there is an ongoing dialogue between administrative agencies and legislatures, and it's not always a harmonious dialogue.
Well, it was somewhat of a hodgepodge legislation.
Certainly.
Right? And so this F2 found its way into the EUEA.
It did,
and,
yes.
and says mandate complete decoupling, but doesn't say how it is done, where it should be done. It just says you can petition for it. And in that regard, if full decoupling is allowed and any factor is potentially available to be reviewed, shouldn't that be done in a full rate case setting?
It can, but I would submit it need not be, as the petition that's since been dismissed was at least attempting to do. There are certainly prudential reasons why you may want them together, but I would submit that the language of this statute allows it to be brought as a standalone question. And as I think I offered to you earlier, Your Honor, this is a slightly academic question at this point because the outcome of this case is going to my understanding, inform PNM as to whether it comes forward with a decoupling proposal in its next general rate case.
Well, if indeed this statute, I accept your point, Mr. Gifford, but if indeed this statute mandates full decoupling without defining regulatory disincentives or the scope or nature of the inquiry, if it did indeed require full decoupling, wouldn't the legislature have mandated that the full decoupling apply to all rate classes or some set of rate classes, that be conducted in the context of a full-blown rate case? Wouldn't that only make sense? As opposed to, so that you can finish your point, as opposed to a stipulation in Washington that developed the A-Vista utilities partial decoupling that's focused on DSM. Do you follow me? And that, by the way, that does apply to a couple of subset rate classes, as I understand that order.
Well, I guess what I'd say back, Your Honor, is they could have, but they didn't. And that the language here in F2 to our reading says that you can bring it as a standalone petition 1, and it can apply to only a subset of rate classes. And again, we talked briefly during earlier, there are compelling reasons why you might want to apply decoupling to some rate classes, but not others.
But doesn't decoupling go to the fundamental? This is not just a small matter that develops some rate rider, right? This actually fundamentally changes rate design, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't. It is a rate design principle, is what I would offer. It does not change class cost to service numbers.
It guarantees the utility a certain recovery of revenues.
Yes, that is the incentive it is meant to address.
And it shifts the paradigm in that sense, in that as opposed to traditional rate design methodology, it's a shift, it's a change, and it puts the onus on those customers who are now bound by the new classifications.
Well, I guess what I would describe it as, Your Honor, is a public policy imperative that the legislature has made mandatory in the Efficient Use of Energy Act, and it's a public policy incentive to align incentives between the utility and its cost recovery and conservation and other exogenous circumstances.
And where does besides F2, the language that you focus on, where does the legislature say that it's making such a radical shift?
Well, first of all, I guess I would disagree with your characterization of this as a radical shift. I think it's a principle of rate design that has a place in multiple states and multiple utilities rate designs. It is an accepted practice in multiple states for for decades now. While it's a policy intervention and mandate from the legislature, decoupling has been an active rate design principle that multiple utilities have instituted. And as we were talking earlier, some in slightly different flavors than others, but all of them, you know, permissible in different ways, depending on the rationale and the consensus of the stakeholders.
I guess I paused that potentially. Obviously haven't ruled on any issues and I haven't decided anything, but I'm for, well, take away the term radical and say that this may be more, it's a major shift. Would that be acceptable? Major shift? Important shift.
It is an important policy shift, yes, but I would point out it doesn't change the class cost of service. It doesn't change the overall revenue requirement of the utility.
But let me get this straight. You correct me if I'm wrong, but fundamentally you're saying that, interestingly, to remove regulatory disincentives, and I'm quoting F1, in a manner that balances the public interest, consumers' interests, and investors' interests. You say that's not carried over down to the next subsection F2. So that balance of interest is no longer applicable when it comes to what is required to develop a full decoupling rate mechanism. Am I understanding that correctly?
By the terms of F2, that's correct, Your Honor.
That is major. That is radical. I submit, sir.
I hate to say this, Your Honor. I'll respectfully disagree.
No, I accept. I respectfully accept your respectful disagreement, Mr. Gifford. Thank you. I hope you understand the spirit in which I'm discussing this matter with you to try and understand.
Yeah, and very quickly along this line, I mean, one of the things that we're not here, that is not, for better or worse, live here, is a policy discussion of the merits or lack thereof of decoupling. What I'm here to say is what the statute says, thou shalt decouple, and the effect is the commission is obliged to decouple.
Are you suggesting that some of the opponents to the full decoupling in their briefing make policy arguments against decoupling as opposed to focusing on this particular provision? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I mean, I think what you see in the briefing here are, you know, good faith arguments. We certainly have different textual readings and different contextual readings here. I'm not trying to imply here that we're kind of relitigating the legislative policy case for decoupling or not.
Well, no, I am suggesting that some of the arguments made appear to have still a philosophical disagreement with full decoupling.
Motivated reasoning has been known to happen, Your Honor. Yes, I would agree.
Okay. All right. Commissioner Maestas, do you have any questions based on my dialogue with Mr. Gifford?
No questions at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right. Let's then move to the joint petitioner's argument. And so the parties know, after Mr. Herman makes his argument for the joint petitioners, we will take a brief break. All right. Mr. Herman, for the joint petitioners, you please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Medeiros. Thank you, Commissioner Maestas. I appreciate the opportunity in granting our petition and further allowance to argue our briefs at oral argument today. Before I proceed, I was going to reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal. I just assumed you would give us a 10-minute warning, and at that point I would wrap up what other point I was on and save the remainder of my time.
Very well. I'll give you a minute. I'll give you a warning then in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
And you will have, 5 minutes reserved for rebuttal. Okay, starting now.
Thank you. What I wanted to talk about today was the purpose of the Efficient Use of Energy Act and New Mexico's goals to further efficient use of energy and remove the regulatory disincentives that might prevent a utility from otherwise implementing load management and energy efficient resources. I did a quick word search of the EUEA yesterday and found approximately 41 references to load management and energy efficiency, usually coupled with cost effective throughout the EUEA, and found no references to full decoupling, just the subsection 5F2, as PNM argues mandates full revenue decoupling. You had asked about, or excuse me, PNM had argued that we had to look at how we came here and the changes that were made to section 5F. And I would like to point out that the language that has always been in 5F1 has continually been in section 5F in previous iterations of the EUEA, and that is strictly the requirement that the commission identify and remove regulatory disincentives in a manner that balances consumer and shareholder interests. Further, the EUEA states several times that its goals are to require or encourage utilities to include cost-effective load management and energy efficient resources in their energy resource portfolios. And remove any disincentives that would otherwise stand in its way. And had the legislature intended to allow a full decoupling mechanism for whatever the reason, it had the opportunity to take that language out and it did not. There might be some dispute as to the guidance or the language that wound up in the final act, but it has been long established that we are stuck with the statutes as written by the legislature and an assumption that that is how we are supposed to read them. And as we pointed out in our brief, that section 5F went from one paragraph or one clause to one sentence that is separated by a colon, and all those sentences or all those clauses are separated by semicolons, meaning you read them in succession. And you had asked about how we are supposed to implement a full a decoupling mechanism. That might be one place where I not disagreed, but where we were deliberate in our briefing to not use the phrase decoupling when we could and tie it to what the legislature did state was a revenue or a rate adjustment mechanism. And that language is in there in both 5F1 and 5F2. The interpretation that we provided allows the commission to read the EUEA in a manner that is in harmony with itself, as in promoting energy efficiency and load management programs, allowing a utility to implement them and return or earn a return or a revenue on those programs, and further in harmony with the purpose to balance the interests, and then further in harmony with the Public Utility Act that will result in just and reasonable rates. As argued by PNM, we would result, or the end result would be a guarantee of profits, which no competitive industry has. And the commission as a surrogate for the marketplace should not be guaranteeing revenues in in 100% of the instances. And that was what we found through the discovery in the 121 case and the arguments that have been presented, in that this would guarantee revenue for literally any reason, weather, utility mismanagement. We saw a great example of that just this week, in fact, when the cooling tower at San Juan collapsed. Had that collapse been more devastating, that resulted in blackouts for an extended period of time, the proposed decoupling mechanism that we are discussing right now would still allow PNM to charge customers for not having power and the revenues that they otherwise would not have collected. Further, nothing in this full decoupling proposal would require PNM to increase usage or reliance on cost-effective energy efficiency and load management programs. The Water Authority and the county are all for using our power and our resources efficiently, so long as they're cost-effective. And that is the sole purpose of the EUEA. Now, you had asked if we were making a policy or a legal argument. I would say we're doing a little bit of both. We stimulated the tribunal with discussions of semicolons and periods and sentence structure, but really, when we look at the effect of what is being proposed, we're talking about a guarantee of returns for any reason in a way that could result in both piecemeal and retroactive rate making. And then as we pointed out in our response brief, a proposal that sends a completely wrong price signals to consumers, and that the result would be a declining block rate. Customers would see on their bills in high usage months a much larger decoupling credit, and in low usage months or months where they took active roles to reduce their use, a much higher decoupling bill credit. And to a savvy consumer, or maybe not so savvy, but to a consumer who sees that credit going higher the more that they use, thank you, they have no disincentive to reduce their usage during some of our highest usage months. In fact, they have more incentive to increase their usage. But the reality is they're paying for their fixed costs and revenue per customer through their volumetric charges, just a little bit less with this decoupling rider. And that is just generally discouraged by the commission as far as sending accurate price signals that will influence customer behavior to the benefit of the system. And also not penalizing them for using less. That among other things is the policy and our legal incentive, or our legal argument for why we believe that this is not in the public interest and is contrary to what the legislature intended and does not effectuate the cause of the EUEA. Thank you, and I'll reserve the rest of my time. And
that's about, I guess, 6 minutes now.
Oh,
Is that correct, Mr. Herman?
I believe so. I might have misinterpreted.
Yeah. No, that's what I have, approximately 6 minutes for rebuttal. And I apologize, I didn't give the 5-minute warning. I was busy trying to follow along and find some of your argument. So I apologize for that. But in any event, thank you, Mr. Herman. Commissioner Maestas, any questions for Mr. Herman?
Yes, Mr. Herman, so I think the big argument has been do the principles in F1 carry over to F2 in the statute? And it seems that is your position, that the public interest part of F1 applies to F2?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for your question. Not only do we say that F1 carries into F2, we argue in our brief that F1 through 4 needs to be read in harmony. So that also, I believe, includes the opportunity to earn a return on its investment, that would be F3, and that the ROE should not be adjusted downward as a, let's say, as a reaction to allowing this return. And I think that's an important distinction as well, because my understanding of PNM's argument is that this would grandfather in their ROE for any reason. And if that were done in a rate case, generally that ROE is established under a number of factors. And I think the only factor that shouldn't be included would be its implementation of a revenue adjustment mechanism.
So Mr. Herman, then you contend that traditional ROE and a traditional rate design is an opportunity, not a guarantee. So are you saying that under this rate decoupling that an ROE would be a guarantee instead of an opportunity?
It would be a guarantee to the amounts expended and the sales lost, specifically due to their revenue adjustment mechanisms, or I'm sorry, to their load management and energy efficiency mechanisms.
My last question, Mr. Herman, PNM contends that rate decoupling is kind of a principle of rate design that's accepted nationally. Based on your information, do you see any commonality of national applications of rate decoupling to PNM's position?
I wouldn't dispute that it has been accepted in other commissions, but I would say that as it is interpreted with the laws of New Mexico, the proposal that they have proposed does not meet the standards.
Thank you, Mr. Herman. That's all I had.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Maestas. Mr. Herman, you heard my colloquy with Mr. Gifford.
Yes.
I see. And I was trying to focus with him on why, in part, he didn't, and CCA, WRA, and REIA didn't talk about partial decoupling. They just talk about full and limited decoupling. And in your brief on page 6, on the other hand, you highlight a lot of language, and yet, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see in your brief where you deal directly with the meaning of the language that PNM and the proponents of full decoupling in this proceeding are seizing, and that's under F2, which is a rate adjustment mechanism that ensures that the revenue per customer approved by the commission in a general rate case proceeding is recovered by the public utility without regard to the quantity of electricity or natural gas actually sold by the public utility subsequent to the date the rate took effect. In your mind, what does that language provide? What does it mean?
Well, I think you did not mention the first half of that sentence, which is remove the regulatory disincentives through a rate adjustment mechanism. And I mention that because we need to talk about the definition of regulatory disincentives. And we contend repeatedly.
Well, here, let me stop you there. And the reason I did that is because the proponent's provision contention is that regulatory disincentives may be limited to energy efficiency and load management. But the way to deal with that is full decoupling, the language that I emphasized. that I quoted. Did I misapprehend Mr. Gifford's argument?
I don't know, I can't speak for Mr. Gifford, but I do understand if I understand your question being, the revenue per customer, that's regardless or irrespective of sales. You know, I'll admit that's a tough nut to crack, but I think by our argument, without going into that, we need to read it as a whole, would be that revenue per customer should be established in a general rate case with decoupling in mind.
Yeah.
When we or with a revenue adjustment mechanism in mind tied specifically to load management and energy efficiency. Because I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
that's fine.
Ideally, this would be done in a rate case where we can look at the complete picture and using, let's say, a stale revenue per customer to establish this mechanism doesn't necessarily take into account all the possible implications that it could if it were outside the general rate case.
The language that I quoted to you that you don't highlight in your brief there on page 6, as opposed to the other provisions that you say we need, and I agree, we need to read the statute as a whole in parliamentaria with other applicable provisions of the EUEA and perhaps the Public Utility Act. But the key language there that I'm talking about, it certainly looks like a classic revenue per customer deferral decoupling or balance account decoupling, doesn't it?
That is what's being argued by the other joint petitioners.
You don't think that's decoupling language based on what your understanding of the term?
I would agree that, but I still think that would be limited to energy efficiency and load management.
Right, and that potentially goes back to what I'm talking about in terms of a partial decoupling.
Yes.
Do you understand?
I do.
I need to give the commission my best understanding of what the language is, using all of the parts of the statute, including those that the proponents want to emphasize, as opposed to those that the opponents want to emphasize. And so the extent to which that we can say, yeah, that certainly looks like decoupling language. However, how do we grapple with it when regulatory disincentives are not defined? There's no procedure set out. The proponents are saying that the balancing of public interest, consumer interest, and investor interest is not applicable in the context of this F2. Do you have any comment on that? Do you understand where I'm going with that?
Yes, and I would admit that would be decoupling language, but I would not necessarily admit that it would be full decoupling language. And I think that might be where we get into the distinction between full, partial, and did you say incomplete decoupling or?
Limited.
Limited decoupling, thank you.
Yeah. Now, and then I just to understand your position in your brief, you talk about at points where customers who are energy profligate as opposed to energy efficient would have a perverse incentive under the decoupling mechanism. Are you making an argument there against decoupling as a principle, whether it's partial or full decoupling, or is that a more focused argument?
I'm making it with regard to the purpose of the EUEA as a whole.
Okay, so it is essentially a position against decoupling.
Yes,
it's a policy argument, in other words.
Well, one that's partly due in conformance with the EUEA, but one that's also in line with the general rate making principles that we do under the Public Utility Act, where customers are given correct price signals to influence their behavior.
Right, and I'm not coming to this oral argument to criticize anybody, just to understand the arguments
Yes,
and their meaning. That's all.
understood.
Okay, thank you, sir. All right, before we move to the next argument of Ms. Nanazi, let's take a quick 5-minute break. We'll be back at approximately 3:21 or 3:22. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We're in break.
I'm not happy about that, but we got a long way to go.
So you don't forget to lock it. I'm gonna leave your keys in there.
All right. Big kiss.
Let's move. You still got time.
I'll just wait here. Can you top off this bottle of water? It's fairly full, but I have no idea what I'm in for. It's 3:30. Yeah, I think 5, if not later.
David, you're not muted.
Oh, that's all right. I was just talking to my wife, speculating that this is going to be longer than I thought.
Uh,
I have never done an oral argument in the PRC, so I didn't know what to expect.
I thought it'd be shorter than this too.
Well,
I've been texting people.
I'm sure these are issues that need to be addressed. Otherwise, they wouldn't be.
For sure. For sure.
Mr. Lee, I'm sorry. I thought you might have wanted a break.
Yes, thank you very
Apologies for that. All right. Ms. Nanazi?
Thank you.
You have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think that when you said, Mr. Hearing Examiner, this subverts the regulatory paradigm, and that is not the statute itself, but PNM's interpretation of the statute. Our Constitution creates the Public Regulatory Commission and provides that it, quote, shall have the responsibility for regulating public utilities. And that's the New Mexico Constitution, Article 11, Section 1 and 2. It's the only agency that New Mexico decided that, first of all, is in the Constitution, and that is so that it's constitutionally mandated. Central to this law is relating to the setting of rates and the rates of ratepayers. It is the declared policy of the state that the public interest, the interest of consumers and investors, require regulation and supervision of public utilities to the end that reasonable and proper services shall be available at just, fair, and reasonable rates. As you know, that's the Public Utility Act. Rates include every rate, tariff, charge, or other compensation for utility service. Again, the Public Utility Act. There is a myriad of Supreme Court decisions, as well as PRC cases that talk about the Commission's general and exclusive power to regulate a public utility. Actually, the Commission has the obligation to ensure that every rate made, demanded, or received by any public utility is just and reasonable. And PNM wants us to ignore regular construction of law by only reading one part, the part that is added in F2, and ignoring not only everything in the Public Utility Act and everything in the energy efficient EEUA, energy efficient use, energy, you know what it stands for, EUEA, that's it. Sorry. But then also the entire statute itself. And, you know, we've pointed to, of course, the in the statute itself, it says balance the interests of the public, consumers, and investors. And the thing about that is that PNM argued, well, why didn't they just repeat that language in section 2? Well, if you look at other statutes, that's not how statutes are written. That would be silly. I mean, it would just not make any actual common sense, because then you'd be repeating everything every single time in every subsection of a statute. And that's not how, and we argued it, and the joint movements argued it as well. That's not how regulatory construction works. The other thing that's very important here is that, and I know this harks back to the case that was brought, but it says specifically that the rate adjustment mechanism in F2 ensures that the revenue per customer approved by the commission in a general rate case, not anywhere else. It says it's got to be done in a general rate case. So I'm not saying that that language requires that a decoupling proposal has to be brought in a general rate case, though that's advisable. But the revenue per customer from which a rate must have been decided in a general rate case. And we don't have that here. And so I think that's important. But then, I think that you and Commissioner Maestas asked about, well, what is happening about decoupling in all the states in the country. And so one of those things is that they pretty much all require that the decoupling proposal be in a rate case. And it's for the reasons that Mr. Herman spoke about before. I think that there is no question that this statute, the plain reading of the statute, does not talk about full decoupling. It talks about cost-effective, energy efficient, and load management programs, meaning that it is your job, the commission's job, to determine that if there is a decoupling mechanism, that it only be done if the utility who has the burden of proof proves that it's cost effective. It also only relates to energy efficiency and load management, and does not say for whatever reason, including imprudence, including, coal silo breakdown.
Well, Ms. Nanazi, can I interrupt you? Because I want to ask the question now, but I'll add to the time for you. Are you listening? I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. But the revenue per customer classification needs to be approved in the general rate case proceeding. But the rate mechanism doesn't necessarily have to be created in the rate proceeding, does it?
I would argue that it should, to fairly balance the interests of the public and the consumers and the investors. But I agree that it doesn't necessarily have to, but the revenue per customer does. And that's the reason why. It's because, precisely because there has to be an opportunity for there to be a give and take of decision-making about what that should be. I just want to also alert the commission that there are definitely white papers out there that caution against full decoupling, and that are raise the white flag about that this isn't the necessarily the appropriate way to address the regulatory disincentives. I think that we need to define regulatory disincentives, but it certainly does not mean anything goes. It is specific to what might be under the rubric and control of the regulatory agency, and does not include weather or other factors that are, and you raised the pandemic, for instance, other factors that are outside of the regulatory rubric. I will just end by saying that the fallacy of PNM's position that the law mandates full decoupling is contrary. You would have to read that the Efficient Use of Energy Act, the Public Utility Act, the Supreme Court precedent, and the PRC precedent would have to be ignored in order to justify PNM's position. And I don't think that that's what the legislature intended. And I don't think that that's what the plain language of the statute says. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nanazi. Commissioner Maestas, any questions for New Energy Economy?
Yes, good afternoon, Ms. Nanazi. In your initial brief, at the top of page 11, you talk about reducing the burden of energy costs on low-income customers. So do you think there's some kind of a social equity issue as well at play here? Because many low-income ratepayers don't even know how to seek assistance for weatherization or energy efficiency. And a lot of the old housing stock that they live in has more fundamental health code violations that precludes energy efficiency measures. And so what's your fear here in terms of the maybe silent impacts or potential impacts to low-income customers? And I assume under a partial decoupling, right? That would only apply for a few rate classes.
That's right. I think that there's questions about, again, this is one of the reasons why I think it should be in a rate case. So these kinds of issues could be discussed to determine what kind of actual impact there would have. And therefore, then the hearing examiner and commission could decide, okay, does that fairly balance the interests of ratepayers? So that's the first thing, which is I think it has to be in a rate case. And second of all, I think also, using outdated information, which is not directly, but somewhat directly related to your question, which is that you have to use contemporaneous information, I think is important. And then, yes, there's been evidence that, and this is what I was referring to, the AARP has come out against decoupling. I think that there's been a number of economic studies that have come out and say that, in fact, decoupling, while it doesn't raise the rates for, let's say, middle and upper class people of economic means, it disproportionately impacts people who are suffering from poverty, including that in some instances, the rates have risen as much as 20% within the first 2 years of a decoupling statute that has been. And there's been a number of states that have, after seeing exactly the issue that you just raised, have modified their decoupling statute just because of that, so that there is protection for them.
And so I guess my last question is, it seems that you consider, this proposal by PNM as single issue or piecemeal rate making, and that it should be in conjunction with the general rate case.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think that it goes to the first statement that I made, which is the requirement that you set rates that you balance the interests of ratepayers and investors, and that you determine to the best of your ability what the result, the actual impact to rates will be for different rate classes of decoupling. I'm not a fan of decoupling. I don't think that the utility should be guaranteed revenue no matter what, not even for effective load management and energy efficiency. I don't think that that is appropriate public policy at this point. I think that we should mandate energy efficiency, and I could go on about what I think is the best public policy, but I realize that this is the law. And so I think that we should limit it to what the law says, not what PNM wants. And, you know, PNM would not be for this if they were not going to make money. Let's just be honest about it. That's their purpose. They have a duty. They have an obligation to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. And I believe that that's what this does, which it guarantees their revenue, regardless of whether it's cost effective or effective load management and energy efficiency at all. And I don't believe that that's consistent with good public policy or the obligations of the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Nanasi. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Maestas. Ms. Nanazi, one thing about the issue that you put forward in joining the petition, which is that pursuant to the commission's rate making authority, should the commission put PNM and other public utilities on notice of the obligation to perform adequate analysis, which includes the use of timely information and may include continuing updates, and that the use of stale information will not be tolerated. That's your issue, correct?
Correct. I mean, I joined on the other issues, but I asked to have that be added, correct?
Right, and I have that in my draft recommended decision as an issue to be addressed. Do you think that now the information that PNM was using in the former case, case number 20-00121 UT, where it proposed a rate mechanism, that was based on rate class customer RCP or RPC information from case number 15-00261-UT. It's 2015 rate case, right?
Correct.
So do you think PNM learned its lesson in withdrawing that rate mechanism in 20-00121 UT? That part of the reason for it was that withdrawing was that the information was stale?
You know, I don't like to talk about what I think PNM's motivations for things are.
Oh, I beg to differ. Mr. Nazi, hold on. I beg to differ. I've heard you ascribe motivations to PNM on more than one occasion, so don't go there.
Okay. Well, I think that clearly the motivation is, again, financial, which they have a fiduciary duty to do. That's why they use the 2015 rate case. I don't think that, you know, PNM deduced the revenue per customer number, but again, when that case happened, we weren't focused on a revenue per customer with the hearing examiner and a decoupling mechanism. So I don't think that that was a fair way to use that revenue per customer data. And part of it, as I explained, and I think that everybody knows, I mean, there's so much that changed. All the resources have changed, taxes have changed, you know, depreciation schedules have changed. I mean, a whole bunch of things have changed since 2015, 5 years ago. And I just think that the problem is that when PNM plucks out a number out of context from years before, and you know, this has happened in cases that we've been in together, where they rely on stale data. And I don't think that is effective utility management or fair to customers and to ratepayers. It's got to be all transparent and forthcoming and contemporaneous. I like to say that when you go and buy a house, you don't say to your real estate agent, let me see the comparables from 2 years prior. You say, give me the current comparables on other houses that I'm supposed to, review. For an individual, a house purchase is maybe one of the greatest, financial commitments of their life. Well, the same thing with some of these purchases, whether it's an acquisition of a resource or a determination of essentially what would be a fixed revenue for the company. It has to be done looking at a holistic, comprehensive way where the information is contemporaneous and transparent.
Thank you, Ms. Nanazi. Okay, up next in the oral argument is Mr. Marks for CCAE, WRA, and REIA. Mr. Marks, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. As Your Honor has pointed out, no party challenges our assertion that the plain language of subsection 5F2 describes full coupling. Instead, the argument against it is that the commission must look past the plain language of 5F2 to construe it harmoniously with 5F1 and with the rest of the EUEA and with the PUA. Before showing why the opponent's position, no decoupling, is a complete nullification of the 2019 edition, and also I'll try and address the hearing examiner's interjection of partial decoupling, which is, I'll start calling you hearing examiner Solomon, I think. But if you
hearing examiner who?
Solomon.
Oh,
splitting a baby.
No,
which is
trying
to
generally understand what hopefully is not a Trojan horse.
Oh,
to go back into Greek mythology.
Sounds
as opposed to the Bible.
Okay.
One of them.
So, but before getting to that, I'm going to explain why our interpretation of 5F2 can easily be construed with the rest of the Act. As we explained in our briefs, full decoupling is actually needed to give effect to the original EUEA directive that disincentives for utility programs be removed. The narrower mechanisms favored by opponents leave the throughput incentive in place. As our brief pointed out, they're ineffective in theory and in practice when it comes to incentivizing energy efficiency. But even if the commission didn't agree that full decoupling was needed to achieve the goals of the EUEA, and I'll acknowledge in the past it has not agreed that, it is still clear we can give full effect to the words of new subsection 5F2 without having to ignore or change any words in other parts of the Act. F1 and F2 can be construed in harmony, with F1 providing authority for a disincentive mechanism crafted by the Commission based on its weighing of the factors provided, and F2 providing for one specific mechanism available upon a utilities petition. There are two separate approaches which are statutorily compatible, but have separate entry points. Significantly, each is triggered by filing of a petition under the respective subsection. That's just further indication that the legislature intended to provide two separate approaches. One of the fallacies I'll return to is that older enactments in the PUA and the EUA trump newer legislation. That's upside down. Nevertheless, full decoupling is not incompatible with the prior statutory law or case law. It's cost-based and based on utility specific historic costs. We would get to the same total revenue collections with a straight fixed variable rate design. By that, I mean putting all the fixed costs for the residential class in the customer charge. That's something none of us non-utility people like, but nobody has ever said is frankly illegal. And several of the co-ops are close to that. So In expressly authorizing full decoupling, the legislature has not upended any fundamental principles. Certainly no more than were upended when fuel clauses were authorized, for example. As the commission knows, the fuel clause, just this past year, the utilities that experienced very high gas costs, those are some major adjustments that they're now having to spread over a year. The decoupling adjustment in practice is very small. It's a couple of percent. It's not anything significant to the customer, but it is significant to the utility.
Mr. Marks, do fuel clauses not balance the public interest, consumers' interest, and investors' interest?
You know, they do.
You just said that they spread out over time. Isn't that the balance? In fact,
they do.
it's
And Ms. Medeiros, I will argue that the commission, even with F2 interpreting that for full decoupling, still has the ability to require that the mechanism be just and reasonable, and that there not be rate shocks, and that the true-ups be over a reasonable amount of time, and that as I think all parties, and maybe even PNM at this point agrees, that it's not a blank check, it's not a rubber stamp.
So the commission could read balancing the public interest, consumers' interest, and investors' interest into F2.
They can't. They can read their general authority for just and reasonable rates into F2. They cannot do that to derogate the basic requirement for full decoupling, but they can ensure that the mechanism and the specific bases are fair and reasonable. For example, the commission under F2 could reject rates and should reject rates based on 2015 15261. It's just not reasonable. And the commission has that authority. The commission could reject rates that don't have a fair true up. So that authority remains. But what the commission cannot do is second guess the legislature and say, we don't like the policy. And and in order to do that, you just have to violate too many, you can't violate one canon of construction, but you'd have to violate them all. You'd have to not give effect to the plain language in F2. There's no words that you can add to F2 to get to what the opponents want. You can't insert, but only for lost revenues from efficiency programs in the beginning, middle, or end that you think the legislature implied but forgot to put in, and get to anything that's meaningful in the English language. Your proposal, partial decoupling, none of the parties briefed that, but essentially what it is factoring the decoupling.
I found it from your briefing, though.
It's well.
I found it through your briefing and through PNM's briefing, the A-Vista partial decoupling case.
So,
which you don't use and PNM doesn't use.
Okay, so and that's not what our legislature did. The legislature could have said and factored, and without regard to the quantity of electricity sold by the public utility, except that the adjustment shall be factored in proportion to the utility's success and its efficiency targets. They didn't say that, and you would add that in. And you certainly can't get to where the opponents are. But the big problem is that.
And I paused the clock on your argument for the time that I interrupted you, sir. I'm sorry, Mr. Marks, I did. So go ahead. So you have about 3.5 minutes left.
Okay, I appreciate the dialogue. The opponents want us to go back to prior law, where the commission had discretion to determine whether or not a full decoupling mechanism should be approved.
And you're saying the discretion is taken away. Let's just continue the dialogue, and I'll let you have the additional time. You're saying the discretion is taken away.
It has to be, because
did the legislature say that?
It has, because they added a section.
Did the legislature say that? Where does this legislature say that all of a sudden the discretion in rate making is taken away?
Mr. Medeiros, I didn't say all the discretion. I said the legislature took away the commission's discretion to say that full decoupling, to reject full decoupling in concept. And the reason why I say that is because unless you read it that way, that F2, the amendment in 2019 would have no purpose. If all we do is get back to the prior law where the commission has the discretion to decide what mechanisms work or don't work, then the legislature did nothing by amending that portion with F2. F2 has to have effect.
Okay, and I'm seriously just asking to try to understand. So that discretion that you talk about goes back to balancing the public interest, consumers' interests, and investors' interests?
That discretion goes back, the commission always has the obligation to make sure rates are just and reasonable within the statutory parameters. The statutory parameters have changed. The legislature has made the policy call that a utility is entitled to the concept of full decoupling, but it hasn't told the commission it has to talk. This is not as extreme as the ETA where you just have to do it. You don't get to change it. The commission can change things, but it can change that. It can tell PNM you can't use stale data. It can tell PNM you can't have rate shock. I'm sure there's other things it can do, but what it can't do is say, and we don't think that full decoupling is in the public interest. That's the one decision the legislature took away, but it left the commission the ability to use its knowledge to handle various factual situations.
What the commission can't do is the traditional rate making analysis that balances interests within the zone of reasonableness.
You know, as Mr. Gifford argued, you're still doing a rate case. I agree with Ms. Nanasi that when you do a rate case and you know that the results are going to go into a decoupling adjustment, it's going to produce a better result than reaching back into to pull numbers from a case that was never designed for that purpose. We're talking about, as Mr. Gifford explained, this is a rate design issue. It's not changing the revenue requirements. I do want to mention there's been constitutional arguments and other arguments that our laws say that utilities are not entitled to any guarantee of a revenue. I agree, those are good principles, but the converse isn't true. There is no holding out there that says it's unlawful to guarantee a specific recovery of revenue. You may think it's not a good policy. The legislature disagreed. It's not extortionate to consumers. The decoupling adjustment has been discussed. It goes in both directions. In a recent case, and I can't remember which one, there was data showing what would have happened backcasting for decoupling. I think it was the 2016 case. And it showed that there were, in 5 years, either 3 years had credits to customers and 2 had collections or vice versa. It does go both ways.
We've got about a minute left, Mr. Marks.
Okay.
I've added to the dialogue, so we're obviously beyond 10 minutes, but about a minute.
You know, the arguments that the Water Authority made on incentives they're policy arguments, but they're wrong. The incentives and the price signals to customers don't change. If you can save 10% of your bill, or if you have a $100 bill and you can save 10%, take $10 off, that $10 is going to go into the pot with 200,000 other customers adjustment, and it's going to be immaterial to the decoupling adjustment. It's like the joke about, hey, there's a bear, I can't run faster. I don't need to run faster than the bear. I just need to run faster than the average ratepayer. As long as I run faster than the average ratepayer, I'm still getting the benefit there. I think you got to it with your questions to me. I want to reiterate, we don't think this is a blank check. We think the commission still has the ability to make sure decoupling is implemented in a way that's just and reasonable. But the commission does have to implement a decoupling mechanism that works on total revenue per customer without regard to why it's different from the base period.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. I'm sorry for that chime. and for the dialogue, but I felt it was helpful. So I appreciate your indulgence. Mr. Maestas, any questions for Mr. Marks?
Just one question, Mr. Marks. You're a former, commissioner. You're very familiar with the rulemaking process in response to either an amendment to an existing statute or a new statute. And maybe if we had the rule in place, we wouldn't be here, but we don't. And so my question is, what are the prospects for a rule once we address these threshold legal issues? Can we, without a lot of litigation, attempt to define regulatory disincentives in the rulemaking? What are the prospects for, limitations in that rulemaking in trying to expand on, massage legislative intent? That's what it's going to come down to is, what is legislative intent? Yes, we're going to look at commission precedents. We're going to look at, national principles and trends in rate decoupling. But I'm thinking to the rulemaking while I'm listening here, and we definitely lack some key definitions in this. And I'd like your brief kind of opinion on the prospects for a solid rule coming out of this case to address these legal threshold questions.
Commissioner Maestas, I have trouble with brief answers, and I'll apologize in advance. And I think this is, the short answer is this current proceeding is going to make it better, the prospects better. It's no guarantee of an easy process, but by disposing of the fundamental question about what the statutes mean, it's just going to narrow everything going forward. You talked about the regulatory disincentives, and hearing examiner Madero has talked about is whether a disincentive are secular changes a disincentive. I would note that EPE has told us that the pandemic actually caused their consumption, their sales to go up because people were home. I mean, we don't know. We can't predict what things are going to happen. But I want to get to is what decoupling does that the LRAMs and other things don't do is they take away the throughput incentive. One of the things that happen outside the efficiency programs, right now the utilities don't particularly want good building codes. They don't particularly want, that doesn't help them financially. It doesn't help them financially if low-income customers get upgraded to better housing stock. I don't know that they actively oppose those things, but they don't support them. Taking away this throughput incentive aligns the utility with our social policy agendas of selling and generating less electricity in every place, not just where the focus is on the efficiency programs. The efficiency programs are designed to produce results that look good in the efficiency program. When I was a commissioner, I was always skeptical that those savings are real. When we removed the throughput incentive from the utilities, their financial incentives are going to be aligned to truly reduce sales in every sphere and or at least not oppose them. So I do think they are connected to disincentives, and my answer is this is a good proceeding, and I'm glad that all the people on all parties on all sides of it agreed that this was the best way to create a foundation for either adjudicative cases or rulemakings. Let's just get the statute hashed out.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Maestas. Mr. Marks, regarding throughput incentives, couldn't the rate adjustment mechanism be targeted to remove the throughput incentive focused on energy efficiency and load management, like the Washington Commission did?
Mr. Medeiros, as I understand what the Washington Commission did is they didn't try to, I don't think you can. I don't think you can eliminate the, narrow what you're looking at on the throughput incentive. What the Washington Commission did, which was interesting, is I think what they did was, we're going to look at total kilowatt hour sales and true them up, but then we're only going to give you the adjustment in proportion to how well you're
To
doing. on your
DSM.
efficiency. So
Right.
they're adding another vector to it.
So you're
They're
doing
not-
exactly what you say you can't do.
No, they're not saying we're only going to look at certain kilowatt hour sales. They're going to look at all kilowatt hour sales, but then we're going to factor how much of that adjustment you get to collect based on your success and efficiency. So if you're very successful and if you meet all your targets, you're going to get weather normalization. You're going to get to recover everything from DG, the things that opponents don't like to see in this adjustment. If you're not successful in your programs, you're just going to get less money. But if you are successful in your programs, it doesn't. You get everything. So they're tying two different things, or they're adding a different factor after you do the kilowatt hour per customer calculations. And it's interesting, but that's not what we did in New Mexico.
We're not sure what we do in New Mexico yet.
Okay.
We don't know.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Marks.
I think Mr.
appreciate the
Gould.
dialogue.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay. I believe up next is Mr. Gould, if I'm not mistaken, for New Mexico area. Mr. Gould, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Medeiros, and welcome, Commissioner Maestas. I really appreciate the fact that you're involved with this. And colleagues, I'm always amazed when we get into these kinds of oral arguments, how much thought has been given to these issues. And I always feel like, man, I need to go back and do some more study. But I think most of the arguments that we've raised in our brief have already been raised by folks and have been raised in your questions, Mr. Medeiros. So I just want to touch on a couple of issues. I agree with Mr. Gifford that really what we're trying to do is figure out what this kind of clunky language that the commission, that the legislature put into 6217.5 F2, what does it mean and what does it require? I take the position it doesn't require full decoupling, but very smart people in the room disagree. But I think the reason is that you have to take this somewhat clunky language and you have to put it in context, as Ms. Sanasi very eloquently stated. And you can't do what PNM is proposing, and I think what Mr. Marks is proposing is take F2 and interpret it outside the context of general rate-making principles. And I just start with the fact that if you flip over the page in the Energy Efficiency Act to 6217.3, the policy itself states that the customer rates have to be balanced, and that the regulatory disincentive mechanism has to end up with just and reasonable rates. So you can't take, I don't think you can take F2 and divide and separate it, divorce it from the policy statement in the very same statute.
Well, Mr. Gould, can I interrupt?
Sure,
Interject that
absolutely.
point? Just in reading the statute, when you look at subsection, you look at section 3,
Yeah.
17-3, all of the language is in there. But then, and that's carried over basically to F1 for the most part. But then in F2, then regulatory disincentives and that other language regarding balancing is removed, but both times it's removed.
Well, it's removed, and I think Mario made a good point. You don't have to, if you state the policy,
Continue.
you don't have to put it in every single little little section of the statute. Like you can look at the Public Utility Act, section 6281 says every rate that is
So-
charged has to be just and reasonable. That's not
So that's-
repeated. Yeah.
No, and that's one way of reading it. The other way of reading it is that you're making some real pretty major radical changes.
Yeah, I agree.
Just-
That
and-
it could go both ways. I have no
Which
disagreement
is,
with that.
and right.
Yeah, I just prefer the way that I think limits decoupling to its proper role, which is if you can create a rate mechanism that can decrease the throughput incentive and also get the utilities fully behind DSM and really active and strong energy efficiency programs, everybody benefits. So that's what we would try to do. But if you look at the language in F2, you could take that same language and says it doesn't require decoupling. What it requires is straight fixed variable rates. Because it says, the real problem here is the fact that I think, and my clients all have essentially some modified version of straight fixed variable rates. The real problem is that the basic rate design for the classes to which PNM wants to apply this full decoupling, I think, have historically had bad rate design. You would not price any other product in the marketplace where you would say, we're going to adjust the cost of your car that you buy from Rich Ford by how many miles you drive a year. No, I mean, I can't go into Rich Ford and say, I'm only going to drive it 5,000 miles, so charge me $10,000 for a $15,000 car. That's kind of what we're doing with these residential rates, where the service charge is so low that it only covers like 10 or 15% of the fixed cost to serve that customer, and everything else has to be through the volumetric rate. So I think that what the commission needs to do is kind of a two-part thing. They need to start moving the classes that have these, I think, non-market-based rates to more of a demand charge kind of a rate that sends a proper signal to the customer and says, look, this is how much it cost us, PNM, to have all of this equipment, all of these people ready to stand by and serve. And we can still have, even my customers, I think the calculation in one of the cases was that even with the demand charges, only 70% of the fixed costs are being covered by some of the big customer rates like rate class floor and 30. But I think that's the direction we need to move. If we move in that direction, then we lessen the impact of even full decoupling. We can really limit it, which I think we should, because I think it sends a wrong price signal too. It's sort of like saying you bought a product last year, and now we're going to come back, and after you've consumed that product, you get no price signal, except later on, a year later, we come back and say, you owe us more money for that product you consumed 6 months ago. So I really think it is a rate design issue, but I would say that what we have to do is we have to look at that kind of clunky language in F2, and we have to say it has to be in the context of the regulatory compact, which does, and I disagree with Mr. Marks, does have a constitutional component, because all the cases that talk about that regulatory term of art, just and reasonable rates, say it has a constitutional component.
With that shift there, and I paused it for the time that we talked.
No, it's
with that shift from F1 to F2, and all of a sudden you're changing the regulatory compact. Don't you think the legislature should say so? If that's what's intended?
If that's what they intended, they should say so. But my further argument, and they should have then gone back and removed the just and reasonable language from the policy provision, and they should have removed it from F1, and they should have gone back to the Public Utility Act and changed the policy statement there, and they should have changed 6281, in which they would have said, yeah, well, some rates don't need to be just and reasonable, and the commission has no discretion.
As opposed to in the ETA, the hodgepodge legislation, you get this provision, and then you see how it's applied down the road.
Yeah,
hope for the best.
It's tough. I do think I agree with Commissioner Maestas's observation in his question, which is we really do need to get through this process of interpreting the statute. I agree with Jason that will be really helpful, but then we need to figure out and sit down and do the same kind of discussion and have a good rulemaking.
How do you feel about my observations about partial decoupling?
I think
Trying to make sense of the language.
I think that would be a way forward. I don't think an either or, really, really minimal. I think if we can find a middle path, and I'm not the expert on those issues, but I think there are good ways to design the rates to where we can start moving them to more market type of rates where the customer's getting the proper signal. At the same time, we protect the utility and have some kind of partial decoupling and recognizing that we're in a transition period.
Okay.
That would be my suggestion, but I thank you for listening, and I've learned a lot today, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. Commissioner Maestas, excuse me. Commissioner, do you have any questions for Mr.
I have no
Gould?
questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Borman, you have 10 minutes. Are you ready?
Thank you. I am ready.
Okay.
Mr. Harris, and thank you very much. I shouldn't use most of my time. I don't have a whole lot to say here. If you've read our brief, we based our comments in this case on our review of the Public Utility Act and on the Efficient Use of Energy Act. The primary point that we try to make in our comments is that the commission is not a mere rubber stamp for approval of a proposed decoupling mechanism. Rather, the commission must view the proposal broadly in a way that reviews the impact on all stakeholders. We cite the statute 62-17-5F1, which states that any decoupling mechanism approved by the commission must be done in a manner that balances the public interest, consumers' interests, and investors' interests. And we point out that this is with the overall policy of the Public Utility Act, where the public interest, the interests of consumers, and the interests of investors require the regulation and supervision of public utilities. I think you cannot view this one subsection of this statute in isolation, as PNM seems to be arguing. They seem to be arguing that this is the only part of the statute, only part of the entire section of the code that matters. And I think that argument is, well, I don't see how you can even support that argument. I mean, I admire.
Was it fair to say that it'd be reading it in a vacuum?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. The commission has authority that's given to it throughout the Public Utility Act. And basically the argument is that, well, in this one narrow area, the commission just doesn't have any authority. And that's what was intended by the legislature. And I don't think that's really credible. I mean, I do admire the boldness of the argument, that the commission is required to accept whatever PNM proposes, customers be damned. I mean, I gotta admit, that's a really, that's really going out there. But I don't think that's what the statute requires. And I think it's clear from looking at the remainder of the energy, the Efficient Use of Energy Act and the Public Utility Act. I mean, it seems clear that the commission's authority still does exist. It still does have at least some authority to rule on, a particular application or proposal put forth by PNM.
Mr. Borman, I don't know that it's a be damned your stock argument. I think it's more the language isn't as clear as people want it out to make it out to be, and therefore we're going to make an argument that supports full decoupling because we have to work around other language that's problematic.
And that's fair. And I mean, I admit that what, my point is hyperbolic. But I mean, I do think that to me, it's a tough argument to make that the commission has no authority whatsoever in this area. I mean, I just don't see how you can construe the statute.
I want to hear that argument again from Mr. Gifford. If that, yeah, in his rebuttal, if that's what's being made, I want that to be clear. So go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't have a whole lot more to add. I mean, I do tend to agree with the points that you raised, and I think other parties have discussed, is that, there's this regulatory compact that exists, and it's an essential part of regulation here in New Mexico, as well as regulation everywhere. And, as part of that regulatory compact, the Utility Commission has authority to look at the proposals that are made by utilities and opine on them. And you had a question?
Would you agree then that the question becomes whether full decoupling fits or must be jammed into somehow or eviscerates the regulatory compact?
Yeah, I guess we didn't make that distinction in our brief on full decoupling versus partial decoupling. So I guess I don't particularly have an opinion on that. But I do think, I mean, if that's how you look at it.
Well, no. I didn't phrase my question. Irrespective of partial, the full decoupling mechanism, full decoupling,
yes,
as proposed, that I may hear the argument that no, that doesn't eviscerate, that doesn't undermine or subvert the regulatory compact.
Well, I think
I may hear that argument.
I think the commission at least has the authority to look at that.
Yeah.
But
you're saying that takes the discretion away, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that discretion is essential to the whole concept of the regulatory compact, as we've discussed, and the commission's authority is set forth in the PUA.
Right.
And so I stand for questions if anybody has some.
Mr. Maestas, any questions for staff?
Yeah, I do. Good to see you, Mr. Borman.
Good to see you.
The last sentence of the last full paragraph of page 3 in your brief, when you talk about the commission is not merely a rubber stamp on such a request, but the last part of that sentence you say, but must investigate the request to ensure that the requested mechanism does not place a disproportionate burden of risk or expense on the utility's customers. So are you implying that maybe partial decoupling could do that if it only applies to certain classes, or is this more of a blanket disproportionate or a fear of a disproportionate burden to all rate classes? So I don't understand that. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, and I'll try. Thank you for the question. I do think, at least as written, it was meant to be more a broader statement. I mean, but it could apply to the partial decoupling issue. But I think it's meant that the commission should have the opportunity to review and issue an order on whatever the proposal is and modify that proposal if it sees a disproportionate burden being placed on any particular rate class or group of customers.
In the context of a general rate case?
Well, I think, I didn't say that in here, but I think that's probably the most appropriate way to do it, the most appropriate place to do it. So yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Borman. That's all I had.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Borman. Appreciate your argument. Now, we are now in the rebuttal phase of the oral argument, and Mr. Herman, you have 6 minutes. Is that correct? 6 minutes?
Yes, I believe that is so.
Okay.
don't know if I will use the entirety of my time, but there are a few points made by some of the other parties that I would like to address.
Please enunciate, Mr. Herman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. Starting with the argument made by Mr. Marks that no party argued that F2 is not full decoupling. I disagree with that characterization of our argument. Though it wasn't until today that we got into, when we were directly asked by you, Mr. Examiner, whether or not F2 was full or partial decoupling language, where we said it was decoupling language. I do think it is partial or limited decoupling language, and I apologize. I'm not familiar with the distinction between partial and limited decoupling.
Well, the distinction is hard to make. I'm just trying to make sense of the language in a way that takes into account all the different factors and doctrines that we have to apply in a way that harmonizes the language with the law.
Understood. So there was a question presented to Ms. Nanasi about the fuel clause, and maybe Mr. Marks as well. And I think the fuel clause, maybe the ETA charges and few limited exceptions are the exceptions to what should be included in your base rates. And I think our position is that another exception would be revenue loss due to load management and energy efficiency. And that is what's being recognized here. Now, there was some additional discussion about the
and so you could arguably figure out some percentage of revenue lost to energy efficiency and apply that in a rate adjustment mechanism in a way that doesn't undermine the regulatory compact.
Yeah, so and there are provisions of the EUEA that allow for that, and maybe some other provisions of the Public Utility Act when energy efficiency programs are reviewed for cost effectiveness and other abilities to meet their desired effective. You know, if we were going to eliminate that cost effective barrier, we could have some outlandish proposals where neighbors are running to their neighbors asking them to turn off their air conditioners so they can run their dryers. And we would definitely have an issue with that as far as not being cost effective or really in the public interest. But going back to what I was saying, this is a limited exception to what should be included in general rates. And from there was some discussion about later statutes being required to take precedence over earlier enacted statutes. And the one thing that a statute cannot override is the Constitution. Now, the New Mexico Constitution, I believe it's Article 11, that authorizes, yes, it's Article 11, that authorizes the creation of the commission, dictates that the commission should regulate utilities as provided by law. And if a full decoupling rider were enacted as proposed, it could not override the commission's ability to regulate a utility. We have the as provided by law provision, but in so much as it might take away the commission's entire constitutional authority, thank you, that would not be permitted by any statute. And again, we can go into further policy decisions, but in general, the water authority and the county support efficient use of energy, regardless of our source or any other factors outside of the EUEA. The way the consumers win is by maximizing the resources that we have through efficient use of energy. And in that, we do agree with proponents of decoupling and the legislature that a utility should be afforded an opportunity to make a return on its expenditures in load management and energy efficiency programs. I believe that's all I have to state in rebuttal. I would like to thank the commission and yourself for the opportunity, and I'd also like to thank my colleagues on both sides of this issue for the robust exchange of ideas. And also for the record, I'd like to reflect that I do miss being in the room with you all, and I look forward to the day where we can be back at the new building. And I'm also standing while I address the tribunal.
Thank you, Mr. Herman. Well said. Mr. Maestas, any further questions for Mr. Herman?
No questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Gifford, you have the final 5 minutes of the argument for rebuttal.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Commissioner, Counsel. A few quick notes. First of all, I think to say that this upends the regulatory compact is a category error.
Okay.
We are not talking about changing the revenue requirement of the utility. We're not talking about changing the cost of service of the utility. We aren't talking about changing the class cost of service. Decoupling is not going to move fixed costs from the residential class, for instance, to Mr. Gould's clients or vice versa. What decoupling is going to do is bring a rate design principle that sets a revenue per customer.
Well, let me pause you there. As part of the regulatory compact, applying the commission's discretion in setting just and reasonable rates?
I don't think the regulatory compact is generally meant in that to have that specific rate design reach. I do think you don't get to arbitrarily change class cost of service as part of the regulatory compact, but rate design, you can imagine, for instance, Your Honor, two extremes of rate design for a given rate class, right? You can imagine on one end, Mr. Gould's straight fixed variable. On the other, you can imagine an energy only rate. What the decoupling principle that this statute introduces here through subsection F2 is it's pushing it toward a revenue per customer so that the recovery of fixed cost is more fully realized than, say, an energy only rate would have it. So it is a prudential rate design principle that we're talking about here, not changing anything intrinsically to either the class cost of service or the revenue requirement for that given rate class.
But it's changing rate design principles.
Correct. Absolutely.
Eliminating the discretion.
It is saying there in subsection F2 that the utility can bring forward, consistent with the plain language of that statute, a proposal that sets a revenue per customer without regard to the amount of electricity sold or natural gas used. So it is bringing a well-accepted rate design principle to the public policy and regulatory policy of the state. There are at least a dozen states, to my knowledge, that have full revenue decoupling. No one has said that this is upending the regulatory compact or changing the constitutional prerogatives of a commission. What it is doing is bringing a regulatory principle, and what legislatures do is set regulatory policy.
But what it's no longer doing, in your reading, is removing regulatory disincentives on energy efficiency and load management measures in a manner, first, that, period. The regulatory disincentives, the energy efficiency and load management language is not included after disincentives in F2, the first line, right? So it's removing that, correct?
Correct.
And it's also removing the balancing of public interest, consumers' interest, and investors' interest. Right after that semicolon, it's doing all of that.
The way the statute is structured, Your Honor, is that it is the commission shall
Do it.
and there's subsection 1, which is the energy efficiency limit, which is the commission is construed, and subsection 2, which is the full decoupling mandate. And I think you do need to read that statute, as I said in the opening, as an invitation or as a dialogue between the legislature and the commission, where the legislature knew how the commission had construed F1 and then took the next step and said, we think full decoupling is warranted, and here is subsection F2. That's the way I think is the best reading. And I think what is notable, I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Honor.
Which is notable. No, I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Which is notable.
I think what's notable is the opponents of our petition have to kind of invoke meta purposes of the statute. They don't go to the language of the statute. They have to invert the canons of statutory construction, not start there. And as I said at the beginning, we think this is a plain language analysis. And I think that the regulatory compact issue and the constitutional issues prove way too much here. And the rest of the issues as to whether or not this exists. And a final point, and I certainly obviously will take your commissioner's question. It is important to note that a decoupling mechanism is not, as some have implied or talked about it, that it's not an asymmetrical rate element where the utility always wins and the customer always loses. To the contrary, in fact, in past proposals for decoupling, the customer is protected within the bands of a given decoupling proposal, and it can go both ways. So you can get a credit or you can have a revenue per customer true-up. And there's usually a cap on the amount of the true-up depending on what is actually brought forward concretely. I know we're not there yet, but I do want to emphasize that this is to the extent there's any asymmetry in most decoupling, the asymmetry cuts toward the customer's credit or against the customers having to experience that rate shock, which was true of the past docket's proposal, as you may recall.
Thank you, Mr. Gifford. Anything further?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay. Now, with that, after that semicolon of F1 going to F2, you asked the commission to rely on the legislative history of the act and the ETA as probative of your position, correct?
Correct. We don't think the commission needs to go there, but to the extent the commission goes beyond the plain language. Yeah.
But that's where you start. And you've been trained to start your argument with your strongest points, right?
We start with the plain language of the statute, Your Honor.
You emphasize the legislative history pretty strongly, though. I'm not, forgive me if it sounds like criticism. I don't mean it that way. But you place a pretty heavy emphasis on the legislative history. Is that fair to say?
We do go into the legislative history and do contend that it supports our position for sure.
And you know that that may not be entirely reliable to rely on, if you will, the legislative history. My point is, it seems to me that there were some things left on the cutting room floor potentially to get to where PNM and the proponents of full decoupling want to get in this case. If you're saying, this is what this says, and moreover, it also says that you don't have any discretion any longer, Commission.
Well, no, I think what it says to the commission is not that it has no discretion. You know, I don't think, for instance, PNM could bring in a decoupling proposal that within the ambit of decoupling changed the class cost of service. You know, there are still issues that that need to be prudentially reviewed and certainly are subject to negotiation.
But it does remove the balancing discretion.
The balancing is in subsection 1, not subsection 2 is what I would say, Your Honor.
But it's also in section 3, subsection 3,
It is.
right?
Right,
So
the cost effective. Yes.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Maestas.
Yeah, thank you. I just had one question, Mr. Gifford, that your proposal was for decoupling would only apply to residential and small power rate classes. But yet, if you read 6217-5, the first sentence in paragraph C, the public utility shall find that the portfolio of programs is cost effective and designed to provide every affected customer class with the opportunity to participate and benefit economically. And of course, it's with respect to energy efficiency and load management programs. Don't you see any of the other rate classes benefiting?
Oh, I think by all means they do, Commissioner, and those investments in energy efficiency, in fact, historically, the biggest bang for your buck for energy efficiency investments comes from the larger commercial and industrial rate classes. What I think the principle, the rate making principle and the rate design principle of decoupling, where it becomes valuable and where it is most effective is in rate classes where most of the fixed costs of that class's cost of service are recovered through volumetric rates, right? And historically in New Mexico, your residential rate class and your small commercial rate classes are the two rate classes that have very low fixed costs and relatively high volumetric rates. And what the decoupling proposal, what any decoupling proposal, partial or complete, is going to do is start you toward a recovery of those fixed costs on a revenue per customer basis in a more definite way. But I think in terms of the benefit from energy efficiency and load management, that I think definitely does happen and benefits all rate classes.
And I guess just my follow-up on that, I mean, I think we're going to see some permanent trends in residential electricity use because of the pandemic. Do you see this as maybe problematic for PNM?
No, I think actually one of the strange ironies maybe of the last year and the last year, the way we've changed our lives, is if you're imagining a future where A, temperatures are hotter, and B, people are home more, this gets to the incentive problem that Mr. Marks was exactly talking about, right? Which is in that sort of world where you're recovering more costs through higher volumetric use, as a utility, your incentive is to sell more power and want more power to be used by those rate classes. So, the paradox here is well, the incentive mismatch here is in fact proven by what we can imagine one future being, which is residential rate usage going way up, not down or flat.
Thank you, Mr. Gifford. That's all I had.
And
thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Maestas. And in fact, what we're doing right now is emblematic. Literally what we're doing right now, holding an oral argument from our houses. Isn't it, Mr. Gifford?
No, it is. I do think the utilities' interests in full decoupling is going to, as I'll do something remarkable, I'll agree with Ms. Nanasi, which is you can see a version of the world where utilities go back to their old position of 15, 20 years ago and say, we don't want decoupling, we want to sell more power as much as we can because we're making more money.
So so I don't intend to end on a tough note, but I'll just ask you, Did the ETA in 2019 change the policy of the E EUEA?
Well, I don't think it textually changed the policy of the EUA. It did add the provision that we're talking about here in subsection F2.
And the policy of the EUEA is set forth in 6217-3, right?
Correct.
But the legislature didn't add, should be removed in a manner that balances the public interest, consumers' interest, and investors' interests, but for full decoupling in F2, did it?
It did not, no.
Okay. So with that, we've concluded the oral argument. And I do commend the parties for their robust and excellent participation. And also I thank you for allowing my interruptions that I promised I wouldn't make. I always do. But it's in pursuit of a dialogue with you all in that spirit. Are there any other matters or questions to address before we close this oral argument? PNM, Mr. Gifford?
Just a question, Your Honor, and I hesitate to even say this, but I was looking at the Vista program kind of in the interstices of our discussion here, and I don't pretend to have absorbed it, but I do wonder if you want any specific commentary pointed toward that or not. I am perfectly happy to stand on our briefs and our statutory arguments, but I do think there are some wrinkles into what I saw quickly gleaning that program that are in some ways interesting, but in other ways prove our point for such as they are.
Such as, well, I understand. No, I think the briefing is sufficient for purposes of trying to construe the statute and potentially applying it. If you have a disagreement with my construction, then obviously you're free to file exceptions to the extent that that happens. It may or may not happen. Who knows where I come out on this after I read this transcript. Water Authority, County, anything?
I don't believe we have anything else to add or any questions for clarification. I'm assuming if you issue an RD, you'll also issue a order regarding exceptions, or we'll go by those provided in the rule.
Probably those provided in the rule, given how busy we all are in other just PNM cases, frankly. And I'm not going to require an expedited transcript in this case. Ms. Manazi, anything for New Energy Economy?
No, thank you very much. Really appreciate everybody's time.
Mr. Marks?
I just want to take the opportunity to thank presiding officer and especially Commissioner Maestas for being engaged with this and for all the parties for the argument.
Mr. Gould?
I would just echo Mr. Marks' very gracious remarks. This has been I think a unique opportunity to really thresh these issues out. So I appreciate it.
I agree. Thank you, sir. Mr. Albright, I had Mr. Herman speak for you in the county, but do you have anything?
No, nothing separate. I would, again, it's complex issues for sure. There's no question about it. And it's going to take a lot of time and effort from everyone on both sides to try to figure a mechanism that's going to work.
I agree. Mr. Elliott?
No, thank you. Thank you to everybody for their arguments and presentations.
And Mr. Borman?
I have nothing further. I just hope, wish everybody safe travels or safe living for the time being.
Thank you, sir. And as I will give the commissioner the final word if he has any. Sir?
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed hearing this, robust argument. And, as I refer back to my earlier comments, I think this is going to be foundational for the commission going into a rulemaking. And I want to assure everyone we're making concerted efforts to catch up on a lot of these rulemakings, not just in rate decoupling, but transportation electrification. We have this little statute called the Community Solar Act, and we have a statutory mandate to produce a rule by April 1st of next year. But we're going to pursue, kind of duplicative processes to start these rulemakings to avoid having these vacuums where we're forced to have to work with an ambiguous statute. So all your work is truly foundational to hopefully what will be a good rule for rate decoupling. Thank you all.
Thank you, Commissioner Maestas. So with no other matters to address at this juncture in the declaratory order proceedings, this oral argument is concluded and this matter is taken
Mr.
under
Hearing
advisement.
Examiner, I need
And yes, ma'am.
the YouTube thing. If you can make it host now, please.
Okay, make you the host now. All right, but for purposes of this oral argument, the oral argument is concluded and the matter is taken under advisement. And I need to figure out how to make Ms. Kippenbrock the host. So the oral argument is concluded. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Okay, so if you go and hover over my name, there you're gonna see 3 dots. Or you can actually disconnect from your end.
I just did. I just changed you to you.
Oh, you changed me. Okay, now